The sea, living, beautiful and life-giving, seems as you ride to be everywhere about you. Behind, before, around. Now it rises like a lake, gemmed with islands and embosomed by rich swells of woodland. Now you catch a peep of it on your right hand, among tufts of oak and maple, and anon it spreads on your left to a majestic sheet of silver, among rocky shores hung with dark pines, hemlocks, and spruces. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Letter from Maine, 1852.
When we think of the coast of Maine, romantic images come to mind. The beauty and serenity of the sea attracts thousands of visitors. It's a vacation spot, a place to relax. But the rock-bound coast and the vast sea beyond it have always had a very different meaning to the people who live there.
Well, people go to sea, or at least they went to sea in the great age of sail, and particularly in connection with Maine history, to make a living.
Making a living from the sea has been a hallmark of Maine life since the 1600s, when the first European fishing stations were built. Long before then, the bounty of the sea supported the native people who lived there, and the coast was where these two cultures set up trading posts for exchange.
Well, one of the first people over here who really realized how important all of this area was going to be was Bartholomew Gosnold, who had come over from England in 1602. What Gosnold saw was a tremendous quantity of fish, and he gave great stories about how easy it was to catch the fish. He was followed then by Martin Pring in 1603 and George Weymouth in 1605, who went back with essentially the same story. In fact, Weymouth was so excited, he said, "I don't know why they're not coming down here from Newfoundland." He says, "The fishing down here is much better, they ought to come here."
It wasn't long before the Europeans realized that January through March were the best months to fish. Rough seas during these winter months made the long journey to and from Europe extremely dangerous. The solution was to build fishing stations where people could stay for longer periods before returning home with their catch.
First one we find was on Damerscove Island, and that was in 1622, and we don't know much about it. It had a dozen or so men there.
In some cases, these fishing outposts became settlements. Whole families arrived as early as the 1630s, and men and women survived by working together to farm and fish.
Every kind of fish you can imagine, every kind of fish that is here has been used commercially, and every kind of method you can imagine has been used to catch them.
There was a whole variety of fishing styles. There were fishing with nets, there was fishing in weirs along the shore where they basically built traps into the water to catch fish. There was certainly the hand-line fishing. There was lobstering. There's a great variety of fishing going on.
Today, fishing families still work together. The Brewer family has been fishing for generations in Southport.
Like many other families in Maine, my husband's family has fished here several hundred years, starting with mackerel schooners, lobstering, ground fishing, that sort of thing. My family actually came from Scotland and were captured by the British and sent on a prison ship to the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts, and eventually gained their freedom and migrated to Maine. I guess the reason my family stayed in fishing so long is it's varied. A love of the ocean, and independence. Being your own boss is definitely a big plus. It's just a good way to make a living, and to us it's more than just a job. It's a way of life. It's what we do, it's what we are, and we're very proud of it, as I'm sure most families are up and down the coast. I don't think we'd have it any other way. A typical day for a lobsterman definitely is an early rise, by 4 o'clock in the morning. Get up, get some breakfast, pack a lunch, go down to the boat. It's a long day's work, sun up to sundown usually.
father's father was a fisherman all his life. He fished, he was born in the 1830s and started fishing in little vessels called pinkies. And they fished mostly on the inner banks, Georges and the local banks. Then my father didn't like the thought of becoming a fisherman, so he studied drafting and served an apprenticeship in the drafting room at the Bar Ironworks.
James Stevens' father met up with a man by the name of Wallace Gowdy, and in 1920 they started Gowdy and Stevens in Boothbay Harbor.
They rented a building back away from the water, and they built mostly small wooden boats through that period. The biggest one was a passenger boat that was built to run on the river here between Boothbay and Bristol and Damariscotta, and she was about 50 feet long. As a child, there weren't the laws about hazard or anything like that, so the kids were playing around the ships in the shipyards all the time. And once in a while, there'd be a owner of the yard that would kick you out like that, but most generally they were pretty tolerant of you, and they'd let you play around, and so you just actually grew up into it. And sometimes, you know, there'd be a man out sick or something, and who might be doing one of the simpler jobs on the boat, and they'd holler at you and say, take this and put these plugs in the bungholes on the boat, like that.
James Stevens' childhood experiences occurred at a time when Maine's golden age of shipbuilding was long past.
Although there were earlier precedents, shipbuilding and boat building really got started in Maine in the latter part of the 1700s.
In the early years, vessel building was almost a cottage industry in some parts of Maine. Any place next to a deep enough body of water, a river, or a large stream, you might find small vessels being built there, out of lumber which was harvested right there.
Shipbuilding was probably in its prime between 1820 and 1860. This was really Maine's economic golden age, a period when shipbuilding, shipping, the timber industry, and all kinds of small businesses and industries were doing very, very well.
In the mid-1800s, Maine was an industrial center, and Maine was an incredibly cosmopolitan place. People from Maine traveled all over the world on business, essentially. They sailed ships all over the world. They were engaged in trade to all the major ports of the world. The trades that Maine participated most directly in were coastal trades. We shipped out of Maine lumber, lime, ice, and granite, and fish. The vessels that sailed out of Maine ports, by a vast majority, were carrying one of those cargoes.
Excellent shipbuilding sites, good river and coastal transportation, a diverse supply of local lumber, and a tradition of maritime skills all fostered the state's seaborne commerce.
There were vessels built in Maine for every purpose that you can imagine. There were vessels built for the deep water trades, for traveling across oceans and around the world. Some of them with cargo carrying as the prominent feature of their design, sometimes with speed as the prominent feature of their design, sometimes with a compromise between those two, but they were built for the oceans of the world. The classic woods that were used in the shipbuilding industry were white oak for ship frames, elm for keels, and some form of pine for planking the vessel, and white pine for the masts of the vessel. Having said that, though, every type of wood, every type of hardwood in particular, has been used and was used on the Maine coast for building vessels.
For the bigger ships like that, in colonial times, the king had reserved the larger pines in the state. No one was permitted to cut a pine tree that had the king's broad arrow chopped on the side of it, which indicated that that pine was reserved for the British Navy.
By the mid-1800s, the Pine Tree State was the premier shipbuilder in the nation. Maine was also home to many sea captains, and a class of wealthy merchants grew up along the coast.
You drive down Route 1, through Thomaston, through Searsport, through Belfast, through Bath, and you see these great big houses with their gambrel roofs or mansard roofs and the porticos and so on. Those are the physical relics of fortunes which were made by going to sea.
William McGilvery of Searsport was one of those who prospered on the sea.
He had economic interests from Aroostook County to South Carolina. He owned real estate in Searsport, Stockton, Portland. He had railroad company shares, bank shares, insurance company shares. He was kind of a one-man conglomerate. He owned a shipyard in Brewer and a shipyard in Searsport. I don't know if he also owned a buggy factory, but he was into transportation in a big way.
Oftentimes, a schooner captain would also be the owner of the schooner. Sometimes they were part of a larger company, where a larger company would own a number of schooners and hire captains. Oftentimes, like an independent trucker will own his own truck these days, an independent captain would own his own schooner. So there was a lot of comparison between today's trucking industry and yesterday's shipping industry along the coast.
Maine's natural resources were in demand, and merchants like McGilvery shipped goods such as lumber and granite all over the world.
Granite industry was a big industry. A lot of islands were mined, basically mined for granite. Rock was cut out. Much of the granite was shipped to cities to become everything from the Brooklyn Bridge to the Washington Monument to post offices and libraries in many of the big cities, many of the big public buildings. Granite was not just cut in big hunks and taken away raw. It was most often carved up into the beautiful forms that you see on the buildings by stone carvers that were brought in specifically to carve the stone, and then shipped off all done. So it must have been like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle when you got it to the cities. They were all pre-done and they were just beautiful.
This was an interesting aspect of life on the coast of Maine because it involved the importation of a labor force that did not exist here already, which was skilled stoneworkers. And many of the skilled stoneworkers that were brought to Maine by the quarries in the late 19th century were Italian or of other European origin. And so this made a big impact on small Maine communities that were used to being very homogeneous and very Anglo in nature. It made a lot of sense economically to carve the stone to its final shape where it was harvested, where it was quarried, rather than shipping huge blocks off to New York and then carving away half of it in the shaping of the final product there.